September 1944. Evening fell over Camp Swift in Texas. The dust still clung to the barbed wire, glowing faintly in the fading light. Beyond the fences, crickets hummed in the dry grass. Inside the compound, thousands of German prisoners sat in clusters, waiting for another monotonous night. They expected silence, maybe the shuffle of guards, or the heavy clang of mess tins being collected. What they did not expect was a woman's voice drifting from the loudspeaker, soft yet insistent, colored with emotion. It was a radio program, one the guards let play from a battered set near the barracks. The voice wasn't an order, wasn't a political lecture, wasn't a military bulletin. It was a housewife in trouble. Her husband had lost his job, her child was sick, and she was deciding whether to borrow money from her neighbor. The German soldiers looked at each other bewildered. This was not war. This was not propaganda. This was ordinary life. For one prisoner, a 24-year-old infantryman named Hans Müller from Bremen, the shock was immediate. He had been raised on Nazi broadcasts, on Goebbels' shrill speeches, on martial anthems blaring from radios in beer halls. Every program had been designed to harden, to glorify, to enforce loyalty. Here, in the heart of America, the radio dared to tell stories of kitchens, of marriages, of trivial gossip between women. Hans laughed at first. He turned to his comrade Otto and muttered, "So this is their weapon. Housewives complaining." But as the minutes passed, he found himself listening more closely, straining to catch every English word he half understood. His laughter faded. He was confused by his own curiosity. The guards made no effort to hide the show. In fact, they turned the volume higher. Some Americans stood nearby, arms folded, grinning at the Germans' puzzled expressions. To them, this was ordinary. Soap operas had filled American afternoons for more than a decade. But to the prisoners, it was another planet. They had been taught that Americans were crude materialists, incapable of depth, obsessed with money. Yet here were voices, tender, emotional, raw, a woman's sigh, a child's plea, a husband's weary tone, all carried through the static. It was as if the wire fence had been replaced by a window into another world. The irony struck Hans later that night. He lay on his bunk, staring at the dark rafters of the barracks, and realized the memory of the woman's voice lingered longer than the echo of gunfire from Normandy, where he had been captured just months earlier. The voice was more haunting than artillery. It unsettled him in a way that weapons had not. "Why does this matter?" he asked himself. He had no answer, only the uneasy thought that perhaps the enemy was more human than the Reich had ever allowed him to believe. The next evening, it happened again. The guards tuned in the same program. This time more men gathered. They jeered at first, mocking the melodrama. "Who cares about a sick child when cities burn?" one shouted. But their eyes betrayed something else. They leaned forward, listening. The program ended on a cliffhanger. The husband had decided to leave home. Gasps erupted, not from Americans, but from German prisoners. They demanded to know what would happen next. Laughter rippled through the guards, but it wasn't cruel. It was the laughter of men who recognized the absurdity and the power of this tiny drama inside a prison camp. The power wasn't military. It wasn't industrial. It was cultural. And it slipped past the defenses of men who had been trained to resist everything American. Propaganda could be countered, lectures could be ignored, but curiosity was harder to silence. Stories seeped in through cracks no ideology could seal. Hans found himself repeating phrases in English, practicing the sounds of names he heard. Mary, Tom, Helen. He whispered them like foreign prayers. They tasted strange, but not hostile. By the third week, soap operas had become a ritual. Prisoners would pause their card games, abandon half-finished letters, and drift toward the source of the sound. Even those who understood little English pieced together the plots from tone, from rhythm, from the reactions of others. They discovered that Americans were obsessed with family problems, with workplace disputes, with gossip that in Germany would never make it to national airwaves. It was a revelation. The Reich had promised that Americans were decadent, soulless, unworthy of respect. Yet these voices spoke of loyalty, of sacrifice, of resilience. They spoke of pain and hope in ways that felt disarmingly real. For Hans, the moment of true shock came when one episode ended with the words, "Tomorrow, don't miss what happens next." He realized he wanted to hear it. He wanted to know. He, a soldier who had marched into France with a rifle, who had believed he was fighting for Europe's future, now lay awake because of an American soap opera. The irony stung him, but the pull was undeniable. He whispered into the dark barracks, "Tomorrow, I want to know." Not all prisoners accepted it so easily. Some scoffed, calling the shows childish distractions. Others insisted it was psychological warfare, a trick to soften them. One officer, proud and embittered, declared, "Better to starve than to listen to this drivel." Yet even he lingered nearby when the radio clicked on, his ears betraying his disdain. They could not look away from the mirror America had placed before them, a mirror of ordinary life, fragile and unadorned, yet powerful enough to crack the armor of propaganda. The guards noticed the shift. They joked about their captive audience. Some said the Germans were falling in love with American women they had never seen. Others speculated that the real battlefield wasn't Europe anymore. It was inside the minds of men sitting cross-legged on barracks floors, waiting for another episode of The Guiding Light or Young Dr. Malone. If bombs destroyed buildings, soap operas destroyed illusions. And illusions, once gone, could not be rebuilt overnight. Hans later wrote in a letter, carefully censored by the camp authorities, about the strangeness of hearing voices of ordinary people speaking of small troubles. He could not describe it fully, but he confessed, "It is different from what we heard in Germany. They sound free." That single word, free, was more dangerous to the Reich than any bullet. The first weeks of soap operas in American camps were not about entertainment alone. They were about revelation. They showed German prisoners that America was not just uniforms and tanks. It was kitchens, workplaces, families, conversations. It was women unafraid to speak, men unashamed to love, children whose stories mattered. And for men who had been taught to worship only power, that was the most unsettling discovery of all. The barbed wire still stood. The guards still carried rifles. But behind the static of an ordinary radio, a different kind of battle was being fought. And in that battle, the weapon was not steel. It was story. October 1944. A crisp wind rustled the pine trees outside Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The prisoners had just finished their evening meal. Watery stew, a hunk of bread, coffee bitter enough to make them grimace. They shuffled back to the barracks expecting routine. But as the dusk settled and the shadows thickened, another radio clicked on. Not news, not orders, not martial music. This time the air filled with the sound of a piano, light and playful, leading into another episode of Backstage Wife. For men raised on the pounding cadences of Nazi marches, the shift was staggering. At home, they had heard brass bands on every street corner, drums rolling like thunder, voices chanting in unison at rallies. Radio had been a weapon in Germany, an arm of the state. Every broadcast carried orders. Every melody reinforced ideology. To hear a woman's voice break into tears over a husband's betrayal felt like stepping into another dimension. One POW, Corporal Ernst Becker, a schoolteacher before the war, later recalled that moment. "We used to say the radio was the Führer's mouth," he wrote in his diary. Now it was someone else's mouth, a woman crying in her kitchen, not a speech, not war, life. The words, scratched in pencil on thin paper, captured what many felt but could not admit aloud. The guards, some barely older than the prisoners, leaned on fence posts and grinned. To them it was nothing extraordinary. Soap operas filled millions of American homes every day. Housewives tuned in at noon, girls listened while ironing, families caught up in the evenings. To Americans, this was background noise, but to the Germans, it was revelation. The cultural dissonance grew stronger each day. The Germans had been told America was decadent, obsessed with money and jazz. Yet what they heard were stories about loyalty, heartbreak, and survival. Husbands losing jobs, wives struggling with illness, young men choosing between love and duty. The plots were small, but their humanity was immense. Hans Müller, the Bremen infantryman, found himself listening more intently each evening. He didn't understand every word, but the rhythm of English was becoming familiar. He noticed how American actors poured emotion into every line, how silence carried weight, how sighs and pauses conveyed meaning beyond words. He was struck by how different it was from German broadcasts, where every sentence was clipped, authoritative, commanding. One night, an episode ended with the simple line, "She still loved him, despite everything." Hans turned to Otto and muttered, "Do you remember the last time a German program spoke of love?" Otto smirked bitterly. "The only love we heard was for the Reich." The men exchanged a glance, and in that glance was the unspoken acknowledgement of something lost. The younger prisoners reacted differently. Some laughed loudly, mocking the melodrama. "Look at these Americans. They cry over nothing," they jeered. Yet even as they mocked, their ears strained to follow the plot. Their derision was a mask. Beneath it lay curiosity and perhaps envy. The most profound reaction came from officers. Many of them, rigid and proud, tried to forbid their men from listening. They declared it emotional poison, but prohibition only made the shows more alluring. Men sneaked close to radios, pretending indifference but hanging on every word. Even an Oberleutnant who scolded his company for indulging in foreign weakness was seen one night standing in the shadows, listening as a character confessed his love under a street lamp. The shock was not just in the content, but in the very idea of radio used for entertainment. To hear broadcasts without slogans, without commands, it felt like an entirely different civilization. For the prisoners, it was as if the barbed wire itself bent and twisted, revealing a world where life was not measured in orders shouted, but in emotions shared. By November, guards began to notice something new. Prisoners started asking questions in broken English. "What mean betrayed?" one asked, pointing to a word he had scribbled on scrap paper. Another mimicked the sigh of a radio actress, earning laughter from both sides of the wire. Slowly, soap operas were becoming an unlikely classroom. The men were learning English not through dictionaries, but through drama. The irony could not have been greater. German soldiers who had once marched through conquered villages now gathered around barracks radios to learn vocabulary from fictional housewives. They whispered new words in the dark like contraband. Love, promise, secret. Words banned from their propaganda, words returning now through static and story. For Hans, the turning point came one cold night when the camp's electricity flickered. The radio cut out in the middle of a dramatic revelation. The barracks erupted in groans, men pounding fists on their bunks, demanding to know what happened next. It was the first time Hans realized they weren't just listening, they were invested. These weren't enemies mocking their captors anymore. They were an audience, hooked on America's imagination. Later, writing in his letter home, Hans admitted something strange. "We hear the American stories every night. They are silly, but they stay in the mind. I cannot stop thinking of them. Perhaps this is their true strength." Not bombs, but voices. In the months that followed, soap operas would become a fixture in the camps. They didn't erase hatred overnight, but they planted something dangerous: doubt. If America could produce voices that sounded so human, so free, then maybe the Reich had lied. Maybe the enemy was not a monster. Maybe the world was larger than barbed wire and marching songs. Inside those dusty compounds, under guard towers and searchlights. A different kind of battle was unfolding. It was not fought with rifles or grenades. It was fought with dialogue, with sighs, with whispered questions that refused to be silenced. The winter wind rattled the barracks walls. Outside, snow crusted the ground, muffling footsteps of the guards as they made their rounds. Inside, the men huddled close to the single glowing radio. By now, they no longer mocked the American broadcasts. They waited. It was just after supper, when dishes clattered back to the kitchens and the last cigarettes burned low. Then the piano theme began. A hush fell. One prisoner, a young artilleryman named Karl, pulled his blanket tight around his shoulders. He had lost 2 brothers on the Eastern Front. His own hands still shook when he thought of Stalingrad. But when the radio voice, clear, melodic, broke into a scene of a wife confessing her fears to her husband, Karl felt something stir. It was not just entertainment. It was a reminder of home. He whispered to the man beside him, "This woman's voice. She could be my Anna." His bunkmate nodded. Both men stared at the box on the shelf as if it were a window, not a machine. For the first time, the prisoners experienced narrative as a form of release. They were accustomed to propaganda that crushed the spirit, speeches that demanded obedience. Here, drama offered empathy. The characters suffered, but not under bombs. They suffered through jealousy, betrayal, sickness, lost jobs. Their pain was smaller, but more human. Medical officers noticed something peculiar. Prisoners who listened regularly seemed calmer. The fights that had plagued the camp in autumn were fewer. Arguments quieted faster. Even guards remarked that the Krauts are too busy with their soap stories to cause trouble. No official study was ever conducted, but the effect was undeniable. One night, a group of prisoners began imitating the radio voices. A tall sergeant with a broken nose played the role of the heroine, speaking in exaggerated falsetto, making the barracks roar with laughter. But the laughter was not cruel, it was cathartic. In mocking the show, they revealed how deeply it had already sunk into them. For older officers, this was both puzzling and humiliating. Captain Friedrich Keller, once a lecturer in history, called the programs a narcotic for weak minds. Yet even he admitted in his diary, later found among camp papers, that he sometimes sat and listened against my better judgment. He wrote, "It is poison, yes, but it is also strangely soothing. One forgets for a moment the wire, the war, the future." That was the therapy, forgetting. Forgetting the hunger of 1942, the screams of retreat, the ruin of German cities. For 20 minutes at night, the men were transported into kitchens where the greatest crisis was a misplaced letter or a jealous rival. The shift was intoxicating. Karl, who once cursed Americans as cowards, began learning English words by repeating the soap opera dialogues. He scribbled them on scraps of paper. Promise. Husband. Forever. When the guard caught him, Karl shrugged. "It helps me sleep," he explained. The guard only smiled. Some prisoners started inventing their own endings when the radio signal cut off. They gathered in circles, debating. Would the couple reconcile? Would the son confess his crime? In those arguments, they were no longer soldiers, but spectators, critics, even dreamers. And there were letters. Always letters. Prisoners could write censored notes to their families. Many began slipping in cryptic references. We hear strange stories on the radio here, stories of ordinary people. They're foolish, but they remind us of life. One censor later remarked how often the word life appeared in those months. A guard named Private Jack Matthews, only 19 years old, later recalled, "They'd laugh at the shows, but you could tell they cared. They'd nudge me, asking what a word meant. Sometimes they'd even bet rations on what would happen next episode. Imagine, these hardened soldiers acting like housewives. It was the best thing that happened in that camp. What began as ridicule had become ritual. Soap operas were no longer background noise. They were therapy sessions broadcast from across the wire. For some, they opened wounds. Hans Müller confessed to his diary one night, "I feel ashamed. I miss my wife's voice, but I only hear it now in these American actresses. It makes me ache, but it also keeps me alive." The paradox was universal. Pain and comfort mingled in the same sound waves. The Americans did not design this as strategy, at least not at first, but commanders soon noticed its usefulness. Radio kept prisoners docile. They began encouraging its use. Some even brought in additional receivers. The same system that had once spread Goebbels' voice was now flooding German ears with tales of romance, heartbreak, and reconciliation. The transformation was astonishing. Soldiers who once shouted Sieg Heil now whispered lines from Ma Perkins. They were not just hearing another culture, they were being drawn into it. The barracks smelled of damp wool and coal smoke. Outside, frost still coated the barbed wire in silver, but inside, the men leaned close to the radio. The story that night was not of betrayal or love. It was a simple scene. A family sitting at dinner, a refrigerator humming in the background, a telephone ringing in the hall. For German prisoners, these details were like thunderclaps. Most had never owned a refrigerator. Few had ever used a telephone at home. The idea of a kitchen where cold milk could be poured at any hour seemed almost magical. A soldier from Bavaria muttered under his breath, "This cannot be true. They invent fairy tales for their women." Yet the Americans, sitting in the guard room, only shrugged. To them, this was normal. Hans Müller, now listening every night, scribbled in his notebook, "They live in another world, not one of uniforms and guns, but one of machines and comfort. If what they say is true, then we fought the wrong enemy. They are 20 years ahead." The soap operas were not written to shock prisoners. They were written for housewives across America. But the details, household appliances, cars in the driveway, children talking about school plays, painted a picture of abundance and freedom. For men who had marched through the ruins of Warsaw and the ashes of Hamburg, this was unbearable and irresistible at once. Corporal Ernst Becker, once skeptical, began asking guards if the shows were real. "Do Americans truly have ice in summer?" he asked. The guard laughed, tossing him a small block chipped from the camp's kitchen freezer. Ernst held it like treasure until it melted in his hands. Each broadcast layered new revelations. Grocery stores were shelves never emptied. Suburbs where families walked to church without fear of bombs. Doctors who answered phones at night. Even the background music, pianos, violins, jazz trios, spoke of a society where art was woven into daily life. The prisoners compared these scenes with what they had known. In the Reich, bread was rationed to the ounce. Potatoes filled bellies but never satisfied hunger. Soap was scarce. Bomb sirens interrupted every meal. In America's soap operas, by contrast, problems were never hunger or rubble. They were jealousy, misunderstandings, youthful rebellion, problems of peace. Carl, the young artilleryman, confessed to his bunkmate, "I hate them for it, and yet I cannot stop listening. Each word is like a knife and a promise." His friend nodded silently. Both men knew they would never look at their homeland the same way again. For younger prisoners, the fascination turned into longing. They mimicked the accents of American actors, practicing phrases they could barely understand. "Pass the butter," one would say, grinning. Another would reply, "Answer the phone." The barracks erupted in laughter. But beneath the play was desire. They wanted to live in a world where those phrases mattered more than orders to kill. The older officers resisted hardest. Captain Keller, who had once lectured on history in Leipzig, tried to forbid his men from polluting themselves with foreign nonsense. Yet one night, a guard caught him standing by the radio, listening to a soap opera argument about school tuition. His eyes were wet. "They speak of worries we never allowed ourselves to imagine," he admitted softly. Even the small props of American domestic life became symbols of power. A telephone, just a ringing bell in the background, was more menacing than a tank. It proved communication was everywhere. A refrigerator humming in a kitchen was louder than artillery. It meant abundance had been mastered. The prisoners began writing home about it. Letters, censored but intact, contained strange lines. We hear of machines that keep food cold. We hear of lives without ration cards. If it is true, then the Reich is lost. German censors back home would underline those sentences, alarmed by the subversion. But the damage was already done. For guards, it was both amusing and unsettling. Private Jack Matthews noted in his journal, "These men once shouted for Hitler. Now they argue about whether the American woman will forgive her husband. It is the strangest thing I have ever seen. We did not mean to teach them, but we have." By spring, the ritual was ingrained. Every night as the radio crackled, the barracks fell silent. Men leaned in, waiting not for orders, but for the sound of a door opening, a woman's sigh, a child's laughter. They were listening to another world, one where the future was not dictated by orders barked from podiums, but by the choices of ordinary people. And in that silence, that rapt attention, the realization spread like fire. America was not just stronger in weapons, it was stronger in life. The radio hissed softly before the voice returned. Clear, low, steady. A woman was speaking, not in command, not in fear, but in confidence. Her words rolled gently, each syllable deliberate, like the sound of a mother telling her child a secret. For the men in the barracks, the silence was absolute. Forks stopped. Conversations died. Even the air seemed to pause. Hans Mueller closed his eyes. He had not heard a woman speak this way since 1939. Before the war, before the Reich had turned every voice into an echo of obedience. Back home, women's voices on the radio were propaganda instruments. Announcers reading casualty lists. Nurses praising sacrifice. Wives thanking the Führer for bread. There was no softness, no laughter, no doubt. But this voice, this American woman, was entirely different. She sighed when she was sad. She laughed mid-sentence. She hesitated, even contradicted herself. Her speech wasn't perfect. It was alive. I heard her voice, Hans would later write, and I thought, this is freedom. The woman in question was a character named Helen, a nurse in a hospital drama. She wasn't young or glamorous. She was simply human. She made mistakes. She loved. She forgave. For the prisoners, she became more than a radio voice. She was proof of another reality, a society where women spoke their minds, challenged men, even led families. It was both intoxicating and dangerous. Carl, the young artilleryman, once whispered to his friend, "She talks to him like an equal." The friend shrugged, pretending indifference. "American nonsense," he muttered. But that night, long after lights out, Carl lay awake, hearing her voice replay in his mind. The German camp chaplain, an older man named Father Koch, saw what was happening. "They are falling in love with voices," he told the American liaison officer. The liaison laughed. "Better voices than bullets," he replied. But for the Germans it wasn't romance. It was revelation. The female characters in the soap operas carried strength that defied everything they had been taught. In the Reich, women were mothers, servants, symbols. In the American stories, they were individuals. They worked, they decided, they erred. That freedom unsettled even those who admired it. Oberleutnant Keller wrote bitterly, "These Americans let their women speak too much." But perhaps that is their strength. Perhaps that is why they win. At night, some prisoners began to imitate the actresses. Not to mock, but to feel what it was like to speak freely. They softened their voices, added hesitations, played out arguments from memory. The barracks turned into small theaters of forbidden emotion. The guards watched, bemused. Private Matthews later wrote, They acted out the radio plays, men playing women. It was funny, but also sad. You could see they missed tenderness. Tenderness. That was the word missing from their vocabulary. The war had erased it. The soap operas brought it back. One evening, an episode ended with a woman saying simply, "You don't have to be brave all the time." Hans felt tears sting his eyes. He looked around. The others were pretending to be unfazed, but several faces glistened in the dim light. No one mocked. No one spoke. Later, in a letter to his wife, Hans wrote carefully, "We hear voices that remind me of you. They speak of courage, but also of fear. Perhaps courage is not the absence of fear, but the acceptance of it." When the letter passed through the censors, the American officer paused. He underlined the line, smiling slightly. "That's how you change a man," he muttered. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was profound. The prisoners began to see women differently, not as ideals or burdens, but as partners in the chaos of life. Even the most hardened men, U-boat sailors, SS corporals, Luftwaffe gunners, listened silently when the women on the radio spoke. Those voices reached through the wire, through ideology, through guilt. They spoke of love, of loneliness, of longing, and every man there understood. It became a quiet ritual. After roll call, after supper, after the guards switched on the radio, the men would gather, listening not for news or strategy, but for empathy, for the sound of a woman daring to speak. They did not realize it then, but those voices were dismantling something deep inside them, brick by brick, word by word. The fortress of hardness that years of war had built. Freedom had found its way into the camp, not with guns, but with grace. By spring 1945, the snow around the camp had melted into deep brown mud. Trucks came and went, bringing supplies, mail, and news of a Europe collapsing in on itself. Hitler's voice had gone silent. Berlin was a rumor carried on the wind. But inside the American camps, something else was speaking. Steady, cheerful, relentless. The radio. Every morning it played swing. Every evening, soap operas. They became as reliable as the rising sun. At first we thought they were trying to humiliate us, Hans Miller later recalled. Then we realized they didn't care if we listened or not. The stories were simply there. They were living their lives. That indifference was its own kind of power. The Americans didn't need to preach democracy. They simply demonstrated it, through voices that joked, stumbled, disagreed, through radio shows where no one saluted and everyone had an opinion. Corporal Karl once asked his guard, "Are these shows ordered by the government?" The guard laughed. "Ordered? They'd riot if someone tried." That answer hit harder than any interrogation. In the Reich, everything, from news to nursery rhymes, had been state property. Here, radio belonged to the people. Soon prisoners started dividing themselves into listeners and non-listeners. The former gathered near the barracks stove each evening, while the latter sat apart, pretending not to care. But curiosity is contagious. By midsummer, even the proudest resistors drifted closer, drawn by the steady pulse of dialogue and laughter. The psychologists attached to several camps noticed something remarkable. Men exposed to daily radio entertainment adjusted faster, cooperated more readily, and showed lower levels of aggression. One report concluded, "They are becoming spectators rather than soldiers." Soap operas, with their endless minor crises and moral lessons, did what leaflets and lectures could not. They humanized the enemy. The prisoners began to see Americans not as conquerors, but as neighbors in a vast, noisy, unpredictable world. The transformation was subtle. A man who once shouted orders now hesitated before barking at younger comrades. Another started sketching faces instead of fortifications. Even the way they walked changed. Less rigid, more uncertain, more alive. At first, guards thought the shift was boredom, but it wasn't boredom. It was adaptation. The human brain, deprived of slogans and fear, began filling the silence with empathy. Some camps organized English classes using the radio script. Prisoners would copy down entire episodes word for word, practicing pronunciation. "It was the best language course we ever had," one of them later said. "We learned what Americans felt, not just what they said." In one barracks, a group of men decided to write their own serial, modeled after Backstage Wife. They called it Behind the Wire. It told the story of a captured soldier who gradually learns to forgive himself. When they performed it aloud, the guards listened too, laughing at the clumsy translations, but secretly moved. Captain Friedrich Keller, once the strict lecturer, was the most changed. In his diary he wrote, "These radio plays, they are not childish, they are weapons of kindness. They show a life without fear. It is irresistible." He was right. Kindness proved disarming. Where ideology demanded obedience, empathy demanded reflection, and reflection was dangerous to tyranny. The Americans never announced this as policy. They didn't need to. Culture did the work. The hum of a refrigerator, the giggle of an actress, the sound of a telephone ringing in another room. Each carried a message. We are free enough to care about small things. For men who had spent years believing that glory justified cruelty, those small things were revolutionary. They hinted at a moral universe larger than flags or uniforms. Hans Müller noticed it one evening when the radio crackled into static and then cleared. On the other side, a character was apologizing to her sister. The words were simple, even banal. "I was wrong." Hans whispered them aloud, testing how they felt on his tongue. In German, the phrase had grown rare. That night he wrote in his notebook, "Perhaps this is America's secret. They can say I was wrong and live." Weeks later, when American officials offered volunteer work details outside the camp, farm labor, repairs, road clearing, nearly every man who listened regularly to the radio signed up first. They wanted to see if the world in those broadcasts was real. It was. The farmers they worked for gave them coffee, paid small wages, even joked with them. The wives offered slices of pie. For many, it was the first time they had spoken to a civilian woman in years. They recognized her voice immediately. She sounded like the actresses from the radio. When they returned to the camp, they told the others, "It's true. They live like in the stories." And just like that, fiction became proof. By autumn 1945, long after the guns fell silent, the prisoners were no longer captives in spirit. They awaited repatriation, but their minds had already crossed the ocean. The world they imagined through radio had become their new measure of reality. Some began drafting letters they would never send, addressed not to families, but to the characters themselves. One read, "Dear Helen, you taught me that forgiveness can be ordinary." These were not confessions. They were conversions. In the years to come, many of these men would return to Germany and help rebuild its democracy. A few became teachers, journalists, or radio producers. One of them, Karl, later admitted in an interview, "We did not learn democracy from lectures. We learned it from voices, gentle voices." The proximity of sound had done what armies could not. It had replaced command with conscience. And in that quiet revolution, played out over static-filled radios in wooden barracks, America discovered a weapon more potent than any bomb, its own humanity. The war was over, but the air still trembled with its echo. Spring 1946 arrived in Germany like a ghost. Green buds pushing through rubble, birds nesting in bombed-out roofs. Trains carried men home from captivity, thin and silent. Their uniforms faded to the same dusty gray as the ruins that waited for them. Among them was Hans Müller. In his duffel bag lay a small notebook and a single object he had refused to leave behind, a broken American radio dial, pried off an old receiver. At the station in Bremen, his wife hardly recognized him, but when he spoke, something was different. His voice was softer, slower, as if he had learned to breathe between sentences. The old stiffness was gone. That night when neighbors gathered in the dark to share news, Hans did something unusual. He told a story, not about battles or hardship, but about a radio show. About a woman named Helen who had forgiven her sister. The others stared, puzzled. A man beside the stove muttered, "He's gone strange in America." Yet someone else whispered, "No, he sounds free." Across Germany, similar conversations were taking place. Thousands of returning POWs carried fragments of America with them. Not flags or medals, but phrases, memories, sounds. They spoke of soap operas, of swing music, of the calm female voices that had once filled their barracks. It was not nostalgia, it was transformation. Karl returned to Hamburg and took work unloading ships at the docks. Each evening, when the shift ended, he found himself drawn to the radio shops reopening along the waterfront. Most sets were silent, gutted by war, but a few crackled faintly. In those thin strands of sound he heard something familiar. Laughter. Not political speeches, not martial anthems. Laughter. It was as though the camp had followed him home. He saved wages to buy a small receiver. When he finally tuned into a German-language drama, one of the first post-war broadcasts, he smiled. The voices were different. Hesitant, almost awkward, but the format was the same. Domestic troubles, moral choices, reconciliation. Germany was relearning how to speak softly. The Allied occupation authorities encouraged these programs. They called it re-education, but for men like Hans and Karl, it felt like déjà vu. What official pamphlets preached, the radio had already whispered. The lessons had taken root months earlier behind barbed wire, in the glow of evening static. Old habits died hard. In taverns and kitchens, some ridiculed the new dramas as sentimental trash. Yet the very act of ridicule proved something had shifted. People were arguing about feelings again, not orders. A nation that had once lived by slogans was now debating soap opera morals. Hans began teaching at a local school. One morning he asked his students to write essays titled, "What Does Courage Mean?" Most wrote about battles, but a shy girl in the back row wrote, "Courage is saying you are sorry." Hans read the line twice, his throat tightening. He had learned the same lesson from a fictional nurse across the ocean. For months, letters circulated among former POWs. They wrote about the strange emptiness of silence after years of American radio. One man confessed, "Sometimes I miss the sound of English, those voices that made me human again." Another described rebuilding his house while humming the theme from Backstage Wife. Sociologists later called it cultural residue, the imprint left by brief contact with another civilization. But for the men themselves, it was simpler. They had glimpsed normal life, and they refused to let it go. In 1947, a new German radio station in the British zone launched its first serialized drama. The writers, several ex-POWs, modeled it directly on the American programs they'd heard in captivity. Ordinary families, ordinary problems, no politics. Within weeks, millions were listening. One critic sneered that it was moral bubblegum, yet listeners called it hope. Karl sometimes sat by his window after work, radio humming softly, his son on his knee. When a woman's voice came through, calm, compassionate, he saw the boy tilt his head, listening as if to a lullaby. Karl smiled. That sound, he thought, is the opposite of war. Even those who had never been in America felt its echo. Cafes played jazz, shopkeepers practiced English greetings for the occupying troops. Young women imitated the cadence of American actresses they'd never heard, only described. Culture moved faster than politics. A decade later, historians would debate what truly rebuilt West Germany: the Marshall Plan, the factories, or the ideas carried home in men's memories. Perhaps all three. But among veterans, the answer was quieter. "We learned," Hans said in a 1954 interview, "that the enemy had hearts, and that ours still worked." He paused, smiling faintly. "We learned it from a soap opera." By then, he was a radio producer himself. He oversaw a weekly program about reconciliation, choosing scripts that emphasized compassion over victory. Listeners never knew that their producer had once been a prisoner, listening through barbed wire to voices that changed him. Somewhere in a different corner of Germany, Captain Keller, older, frailer, wrote his memoirs. In one passage he confessed, "It is strange. We thought the Americans conquered us with tanks. They conquered us with kindness instead. Their culture slipped into our souls like rain into dry earth." The rain had not stopped. By the early 1950s, German radio schedules were filled with serialized dramas, family comedies, music programs, each owing a quiet debt to the soap operas of wartime America. For many who had endured the camps, that sound was more than nostalgia. It was proof that change was possible. The same men who once mocked emotion now defended it. The same voices that once barked commands now asked questions. Late one night in 1952, Hans tuned his radio to an American station, carried faintly across the Atlantic. Static blurred the words, but he caught a fragment, and she forgave him. He leaned back, eyes closed, the darkness around him soft and full. He whispered, half to himself, half to the voice across the ocean, "Yes, we did too." By the time the 1960s arrived, the world had changed its vocabulary of war. Bombs became deterrents. Battles turned into ideologies. But for those who had once sat in the dim barracks of American camps, the memory of those quiet evenings at the radio lingered like a hum that refused to fade. Historians would later call it the emotional disarmament. In textbooks, it took one line. In human lives, it lasted decades. Hans Mueller's students, grown now, remembered his calm way of speaking, the way he paused before answering, as if weighing not just words, but tone. In 1963, when West German television aired its first family serial, he wrote in his journal, "They are speaking again, not in slogans, in sentences." Karl had long left the docks. He worked in a repair shop that fixed radios, then televisions. Sometimes, when a set flickered to life and a woman's voice filled the air, he would stand still for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. To a customer's puzzled glance, he would only smile and say, "That sound built my peace." Decades after the camps, former guards and prisoners met again at reunions organized by veterans associations. They shook hands, awkward at first, then warm. Over coffee and sandwiches, they laughed at the absurdity of it all, how their greatest arguments had once been over fictional romances and radio cliffhangers. Private Jack Matthews, now gray and stooped, gave a talk at one such meeting in 1972. "You boys were our prisoners," he said, "but you were also our audience. We didn't plan it, but those stories we piped through the barracks might have been the best peace talks we ever had." The room fell silent. Then Hans, sitting in the front row, lifted his glass. "To the women who saved us," he said softly. Laughter followed, but it carried the weight of truth. By the late 20th century, historians digging through military archives began to uncover letters, diaries, and camp reports describing this peculiar phenomenon. German soldiers transformed by American entertainment. One sociologist called it the accidental Marshall Plan of the heart. Documentaries followed. In one, a former POW described the first time he heard an actress laugh on air. "It was the sound of civilization," he said simply. Another, his eyes moist behind wire-rimmed glasses, recalled, "When I came home, I wanted my daughter to laugh like that. Not to obey, to laugh." The legacy spread beyond borders. Japanese and Italian POWs had similar experiences in camps across the United States, but the Germans, with their rigid discipline and indoctrination, were the most deeply shaken. What artillery could not break, empathy did. By the 1980s, American historians began to recognize these soap operas as instruments of cultural power, unintentional yet profound. The scripts themselves were banal, love triangles, business troubles, reconciliations, but in their banality lay revolution, They normalized emotion. They made compassion sound ordinary. In archives at the Library of Congress, a faded memo from 1945 survives. A U.S. Army morale officer wrote, "Prisoners appear calmer after exposure to civilian radio broadcasts. Recommend continued access. Fosters cooperation." A bureaucratic line, unaware it was describing a quiet miracle. Hans's generation passed on, but their children inherited something intangible, a rhythm of speech, a tone of patience, a willingness to listen. When Germany rebuilt its own media, it adopted that rhythm. Modern German television dramas, their slow pacing, their moral nuance, carry faint echoes of those American broadcasts. No one planned this. It happened the way music drifts through an open window. Unnoticed, unstoppable. In 1995, at a symposium in Washington, commemorating 50 years since the end of the war, an elderly scholar presented a simple recording, a fragment of a 1944 soap opera that had played in Camp McCoy. The audience chuckled at the dated dialogue. Then she played a second clip, an interview with a former prisoner. The man's German was gentle, his English flawless. "That radio," he said, "taught me that the world had room for tenderness." When the lights came up, no one spoke. That was the true inheritance of those broadcasts. Not the shows themselves, but the idea they carried, that a nation's strength is not only in production or power, but in its ability to make space for kindness. Some of the very men who had once fought under the swastika became early advocates for European unity. They wrote editorials, taught civics, raised children who questioned authority instead of worshiping it. The soil of post-war democracy was watered by static and sound. The story of how soap operas changed prisoners might seem trivial beside the grand chronicles of battle and diplomacy. Yet history often turns on the quietest hinges. A refrigerator's hum, a woman's sigh, a laugh through the radio. Those small sounds outlasted speeches and slogans. In one of his last letters before his death in 1989, Hans wrote to a friend in Bremen, "Do you remember the first episode we heard? I don't recall the plot anymore, only that for the first time in years we stopped thinking of war. That was the beginning of peace." That line now rests, framed, in a museum exhibit about wartime captivity. Beneath it, a caption reads, "Peace began with a voice." And so it did. When people speak of America's arsenal, they remember the bombers, the tanks, the assembly lines. But another arsenal existed, quieter, invisible, made not of steel but of sound. 1,000 radios humming in the dusk, a chorus of empathy crossing the wire. A nation that defeated silence not by shouting, but by telling stories. War ends when words return. And behind every barbed wire fence where a prisoner once closed his eyes and listened, the echo still lingers. Soft, steady, human.